So hello. Am I?
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm rather unaccustomed to sitting behind a wall when I speak to people, so I prefer to use this microphone. So the Mixed Emotions project is a European-funded project in the Horizon H2020, I guess, funding round, and it's aimed at mostly at small to medium industry. The idea is that we take state-of-the-art emotion detection technologies and create an open source big data platform so that those can be utilized by anybody really who wants to do automated emotion analysis or emotion detection, along with other technologies like semantic technologies and other text analysis technologies. So why mixed emotions? Why is this project funded? Why is there so much interest? These are a few examples of, I guess, visionary applications of this sort of project, of emotion detection and how it can affect our daily lives. You could say that these are optimistic, and a pessimistic person might find less appealing applications. But I prefer to remain optimistic, and at least in this project, the applications are benign. So the sorts of things that we could do is, like if your computer is able to detect your emotional state and knows that you're angry, it might kind of prompt you and say, do you really want to send that email which is going to destroy your love life, or something like that. Or for example, you had a really bad day at work and you walk home and you don't want to be presented with something mentally challenging. You just want to be able to sit down and relax. And if your television is able to recognize your emotional state, it will be able to offer you that without you having to, I don't know, go to the bother of saying no to something else. So this is an innovation action within the H2020 scheme, and that means that it's industry oriented and it's focused more on innovation rather than, I guess, research or pure research. To be honest, that's a bit of a challenge, and I think it's I dare say this, but I think it's a flaw in the scheme because they employ researchers to do this work, and it's not in our interest to do just innovation. I mean, we like to do it as well, but anyway, that's just a comment of mine. So the idea is it's going to be used in a number of, it's something that can be used in many commercial applications, and we have 3 pilot projects that are going to be using the technologies that we're, I guess, enabling and making available. The platform itself is built on layers. First, there's a data acquisition. So we have modules for collecting data from various social media streams, like video and audio as well in those streams. Some of the pilots are providing their own data streams. For example, we have Deutsche Welle is providing their news stream and their news abstracts. Then the second layer is the first layer of analysis, and there's a lot of different sorts of technologies there for extracting insights and emotion, for recognizing emotion in those data streams, but also extracting other sorts of information about the topics or well, you'll see in a minute the diversity of information that we're able to extract. Then there is a layer of semantic integration. So the idea there is to use state-of-the-art semantic technologies and knowledge graphs. For example, a common one used in research is the Wikipedia, DBpedia, which is based on Wikipedia. So all of the information in the info boxes in Wikipedia is applied here. And you use this knowledge graph to be able to put the information in context, to be able to say, this information is about some topic, some person, some place, those sorts of things you can associate with the information. And it makes the information more useful, more actionable, so people that are using the information can say, oh, so where is this emotion located that we have detected, or what is it in relation to, for example. Then, well, the third layer in the project itself is the 3 pilot projects that I mentioned. One is social TV. Well, social TV. It's about the TV which is, in a sense, aware of the social aspects of the people viewing the TV. In this case, it's not quite up to the full vision of social TV, where it's an interactive television. There is an element of that, but more it's about looking at the social media responses to TV programs and to themes, and using that to guide recommendations for TV usage. The call center, this is a partner in the Czech Republic. It's a help desk, basically, or no, the firm provides services to people who provide help desks. And they're using mostly speech analysis, because it's telephone help desks, and they're able to derive all sorts of insights about the conversations and how they went, and the people that were involved. Then the third one is Paradigma Technologies or Tecnologico, I think it is, it's Italian, from Italy. And their business is around business reputation management. So they mine the web and social media to get some idea about how the public and how different parts of the public are responding to a business, a brand, I suppose. Okay, the platform itself, this has got a lot of little details, but just give an idea of the diversity of modules that we have. And language-wise, we're meant to be multilingual. That's a big part of what we're trying to do. In the end, multilingualism is a little bit difficult, so much of what we do is English-focused, where, especially in text analysis, there is infinitely more, well, but enormously more resources available for analysis in English. But we also have partners in Spain and, in Italy also, but that's Paradigma Tecnologico, and the modules that they are integrating with the platform are not part of the open source platform, and they're not listed here. But they are developing Italian language technologies. But you notice there's a couple there where we have a lot of languages. This is our attempt to, through leveraging machine translation, to take resources from the English language and use them to create kind of analytical tools in other languages, especially European languages, because this is a European-focused project. But in principle, it could be any language. Although the more distant a language is to English, the harder it is to transfer the knowledge between languages. But anyway. So just a brief view of the first pilot. I've already mentioned that on the bottom right there, the aim is to try and make emotionally aware recommender systems. So by taking into account the emotional responses that we can measure in online social media relating to a topic that is covered in a news item, then we can use that to hopefully better recommend items of news that are interesting to the users of the Deutsche Welle. This is actually a Apple TV app. They're into some new technology there, but in principle they could put it in their website as well. This is just a pilot, a proof of concept. The idea of these pilot projects is that they're a proof of concept, and if these companies want to go ahead with it, if they feel that it's going to be useful, then they will scale it up in many ways and make it probably much better. But the proof of concept should at least be able to do something. So the other part of the social TV, which is kind of like, it's essentially just a byproduct. Once we have all that analytical data that's going into the recommender system, we can provide easily, using another one of our partners, who I haven't listed here, that have a very powerful data visualization tool. We can very easily provide a data visualization dashboard for the people who are deciding on which programs to show when for Deutsche Welle. Give them information about the social media responses to the topics covered in those news items, which, it was kind of a handy byproduct and wasn't the prime focus, but we're including that as well. So brand reputation management, this is an example of some emotion detection that was done for different banks. I believe they're Italian banks, or maybe they're Europe-wide. People might know better. But you might notice the one in the middle there, laboral, I can't even read the name. I'm not directly involved in this part of the project, but I know what this means. But you'll see there's a thick strip of purple in the top of that plot for the middle one. So about a third of the social media, of the measured emotion from social media relating to that bank is purple, and purple is disgust. Now that's significant. That means that there's a lot of people who are really unhappy with this bank. And it's an interesting point that that's a much more powerful signal than just saying negative sentiment associated with the bank. You know, negative sentiment can mean a lot of different things. I might be sad for some completely other reason and still feel good about the bank, you know, still feel, you know, like the bank in a sense. But if I feel disgust in relation to the bank, that means quite categorically that I do not like it. This is why emotion is a much more useful thing to measure, a much more useful kind of piece of information than just sentiment. I use sentiment as an example because at the moment in business, sentiment is used very widely. It's kind of a standard thing for business to do on their internal data, on social media data, and blah, 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 blah. Sentiment analysis. It's been around for a while, lots of data, really well developed, works reasonably well depending on who you ask and what you expect of it. But it has this flaw that it's only one dimension. It doesn't have the depth of expression that you can get with a more nuanced emotion analysis approach. So the third pilot is the call center pilot. This is an example of the sorts of information that they can get from, taking a whole bunch of calls from a call center, then they can detect with reasonable accuracy the age of the callers. They can look for particular keywords related to topics of interest to the call center in the call, and produce graphs like this where they can identify that, for example, the older people in the 60 to 80 age group, very concerned about the fee, quite a bit of questions around the number on the card, but they're not talking about the rest. They're not talking about the bill very much. The grey part in the middle is quite small. Whereas if you look at the younger people, 0 to 20 years, well, there's not as many of them, but around, well, over a half, close to 2/3, talking about the bill. They're concerned about the bill, and they're concerned about being monitored. So you can see that the call centers can use this information to help guide the conversation or in fact to give the people talking to the customers insights into the sorts of things they might expect from different types of customers and the things that they're concerned about, and then give them information to give to the customers in order so that the customers can get what they want faster and with less pain, and that's a good thing. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about emotion analysis or emotion detection, or let's say automated emotion detection. The first thing that we need to do if we want to try and detect emotions is to have some way to represent them. It's going to become a data item that we're detecting. We need to characterize emotion. I think most of you will have seen much of this before, but I'll quickly run through it. So there's been some work on how we express emotions, and according to this study, a bit more than half is through facial expression. And then maybe something over a third is through paralinguistics, things like the tone of voice, the inflection of your voice, and that sort of thing. And then only 7% is linguistic, the actual words. This is an interesting result, but I would urge a note of caution here. This depends a lot on the context. We are very, very adaptable. I think we saw already yesterday, I can't remember the exact example, but where in a different situation, those proportions can change. For example, if the face is not available, then we switch to recognizing emotion by voice. And there's a study I know where they looked at text-only communication in a chat room context, and they found that people in the text only, so there's no voice and no face. They had emoticons. At the time they didn't have emoji. This was a while ago, before emoji came to prominence. But they were able to express emotion just as effectively as face-to-face communication. That's a very powerful result. Normally, lexical, the linguistic aspect of emotion expression is only 7%. But if we restrict the funnel of communication to only text, we find ways to express emotion in that text. For me, that's a very important insight, because it means that, for example, in social media streams like Twitter, where it's a text-only environment, that people will be expressing emotions there in ways that they might not in a vocal environment, for example. And they will find ways to express emotion, and there will be emotions to find. That it's not a lost cause to look for emotion in social media because it's only 7%. In social media, it's actually 100% because that's the only option. Anyway.
Ian, what's the name of the author? I can't read it from here.
Mehrabian.
Mehrabian, okay.
Do you know him?
Yeah. My name is...
And over here on the right, so this is a rough overview of the sorts of things that we can detect automatically from these different modalities. So from from words, we can find sentiment analysis, like I talked about, sentiment, positive, negative, or also this less work, but some around emotion detection, more nuanced representations, which I'll go into in a minute. With the paralinguistic data, we can detect emotion, age, gender, if someone is sleeping, and in fact, you'll see later there's a whole bunch of other things that in the research literature that people have been able to detect. And then from facial expression, emotion, age, gender, sleepy again, and I think probably other things. That's not my area of expertise. I'm in the text analysis side, so I know these things from hearing other people talk about it. But I'm just giving you an overview there. Okay, so how to represent emotions? There's three main approaches that exist in the literature, or you can divide it up in this way. So for automated analyses, the two main approaches are a discrete approach, where you have a small number of emotion categories, and you try and detect those, and you assume that any other emotion belongs to at least one of those categories. Then there's a dimensional approach, where you put emotions in a dimensional space, say a three-dimensional space, and each point in that space maybe is associated with a particular emotion, or small areas in that space that are associated with particular emotions. So the other approach is perhaps a componential approach. This results in a very large space, a very large number of emotions, and complex relationships between which ones relate to others, or which ones are part of another, and that sort of thing. From a practical point of view, in terms of automated analysis, this is too complicated. That the tools already struggle with the simpler models, and if you try and detect emotions on this on the scale of the componential model, then it becomes challenging. I don't have much here in that direction in this talk, but there are some efforts in that direction where they're using essentially semantic technologies to try and get something approaching the componential approach to emotion representation. I haven't worked in that area myself. I just know that it exists. I also know that those sorts of approaches, at least from what I've seen in the literature, in the published literature, the performance is not very good. The performance of any approach at the moment is not very good, but those are even worse. So the dimensional approach, it's used widely in the voice and video analysis. It's handy because it has continuous modeling. You can get this kind of blended representation, so you can move smoothly from one emotion to another, which in a sense you could describe as more realistic. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. I'm kind of jumping ahead by saying that. But here I was pointing out that a lot of the research literature uses two dimensions, just arousal and valence. If you go back to Osgood's work in 1957, it was, he looked at the way in which you express emotion and found the kind of the statistical prime factors, I suppose you could call them, for emotion expression, and he labelled them essentially by analysing what they consisted of. This valence, which is positivity, how happy or good you're feeling. Arousal, it's about how excited you are or how sleepy you are. And then dominance is about how confident you are, or if you're a bit scared or something like that. And arousal was accounted for about twice the variance of, valence counted for about twice the variance of arousal, and arousal counted for about twice the variance of dominance. So dominance is kind of a quarter of the variance of valence. This is why sentiment analysis is a good first approximation. If you're going to do one dimension, use valence or sentiment. I'm not 100% clear. This is a question I haven't answered in myself. Valence and sentiment, I think, are different things, and it comes down to what the annotators. So these models for sentiment and for valence are built around data, which is words expressed by people that have been annotated by other people for how good the author was feeling or how the author feels about something. So sentiment typically is how the author feels about something, which is different to how the author is feeling. Sometimes they're not the same. Anyway, I've heard anecdotally, and I've looked for a reference on this and haven't found one, so if anyone can provide some reference for this idea, that would be wonderful. But that if you have the three dimensions, valence, arousal, and dominance, it's enough to distinguish any two emotions. So any two emotions that we have different words for will occupy different spaces, different parts of this three-dimensional space, valence, arousal, and dominance. It's a broad claim, and it probably depends a bit on how big your set of emotions is. I would be very interested if anyone is able to comment on that. So the problem with the 2D modeling, if you leave out dominance, it means that there are some emotions that you can't distinguish. For example, valence and anger and fear. They're both very negative. There's a high level of activity, but anger is very dominant and fear is very passive. They're very clearly distinguished in the dominance dimension, but in the valence and arousal dimensions, it's very hard to distinguish. So, and there's other examples. So I'm going to skip over this. Large number of emotions you can model. The integration of multiple emotions. Well, you can represent, if you like, mixed emotions. I'm going to come to that in a second. By two different points, or by having a distribution in this three-dimensional space, or two-dimensional if you like. You can represent smooth transitions among emotions, which is arguably more realistic, that our emotions aren't in boxes. They have degrees of intent or degrees of presence and move around in a continuous way. And it represents shared qualities of different emotions. So for example, anger and fear, they're both active, they're both negative, but they're different. But that representing shared qualities is actually a powerful thing and helps the analysis. A quick slide on, if you're looking at a dimensional representation, you can convert it into a categorical representation and vice versa. You can go back between them, but it's not a lossless conversion. That the transition, it's not exact. If you go from a dimensional approach into a categorical approach, you might miss a little bit. Or when you come back the other way, you don't always come back to the same point, that sort of thing. But you can within reason, convert between the two. So just a quick overview on what is used in the research literature in automated emotion detection. So for text, I've already mentioned sentiment, where that's used a lot. There's a lot of resources. Categorical emotions like Ekman's 6 emotions or Plutchik's, where he added 2 more, are quite common as well. And there's a number of other categorical emotion schemes that have been used. I think we saw another one yesterday that had love in it, which I've often heard is something definitely missing from Ekman's emotions. What's love? Well, it's the same as joy, but it's, for us personally, love is very important. And anyway, that's a matter for discussion. And much much less work has been done on a dimensional approach. I guess you can call sentiment analysis a dimensional approach. Often it's done as a continuous spectrum or maybe a 5-point spectrum or something like that. But a higher number of dimensions, up to 3, is not being studied very much. There's some examples, like ANU, effective norms for English words, and there's some very recent work in Chinese, actually. Someone made a large data set in Chinese which is annotated in 3 dimensions. But yeah, it's not as popular, or hasn't been. We're changing that. In audio video, there's been a lot of work again around categorical, but currently the work focuses more on a dimensional approach. Usually just 2 dimensions, the reason being that the dominance dimension is much harder to detect. It doesn't work as well. And so they're focusing on valence and arousal at the moment in the research literature. Okay, detecting emotion. What's the state of the art? How are we going for time?
Over 20 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. So in audio visual, the paralinguistic, working just with the sound and without the words in the sound, you can see a long list of different things that have been attempted to detect, and something about the accuracies which vary. I think the lowest numbers there are around 40%, which is not very good, but the higher numbers are much better, like detecting conflict, and there was a paper in 2013 where they got 85%. That's starting to be much more usable. This year there was a kind of a detecting emotion in a sound signal, like a competition called AVEC. I can't remember what it stands for now. Audio visual, doesn't matter. Yeah, AVEC is the acronym. So the baseline for that challenge had this is the correlation coefficient. So the annotation of sound is done as a continuous thing. The person annotating listens to it and has a slider, and when they think it's more positive or more negative, they move the slider up and down. So the accuracy is measured as correlation with this almost continuous signal. And 63 for arousal and 71 or 72, I guess, percent. Can you call a correlation a percent? Anyway, that's not too bad. It's out of 100. It's not brilliant, but if you're using it in a way where you're kind of averaging the signal out over a number of different sources, it's enough to provide useful insights, useful and, let's say, relatively accurate insights. If you're using it for one particular individual recording, you'd want to be a bit careful about drawing too many conclusions from it. And I think that's the same for all automated emotion detection. The accuracies are not 100%. We're talking between, say, 15 and 20 or even 30 or 40% inaccuracy. That means that you can't use this for a small number of texts, for example, that the chances of it being wrong are too high to draw strong conclusions. Or if you like, you can use it to suggest things and then go and find other ways to draw conclusions. But if you have a larger number of text, the statistics of it start to become much more convincing. That the chances of getting this signal in all of this large number of texts, even given the error on the individual ones, becomes much less, and you can be, it's more convincing. All right, one thing I wanted to mention, there's the face and video emotion detection. That's a 4-dimensional scheme is being used there. The 4th dimension, expectation, I'm not sure why they say expectation when I've had it described to me. What they really mean is surprise. Maybe expectation or lack thereof. I label that dimension surprise, and you'll see that we're using it later in the emotion annotation work that we're doing. So in text, I think I've talked about that already quite a bit. We get sentiment analysis. F measures up to around 80. I think even the state of the art with good clean data is getting even more, like 85%. this is typically an F measure, which is a different thing to accuracy. It's the geometric mean of the precision and the recall. And if you're not into data science and machine learning, those words may not mean very much. But I think it can be roughly interpreted as an accuracy. You could call it an accuracy that takes into account the fact that often you're trying to predict a very small class. So it's important to know about how many times you're predicting something in the big class to have your small class. And that can be very high. So just a raw accuracy score can be very misleading when you have this unbalanced data where you're trying to predict a small class. The F measure takes that into account and kind of corrects for that. So F measures of 0.8 are not too bad. And as I said, they're widely used in industry. Much less attention is being given in the research literature to detection of emotion. Most of it is used a categorical approach and Plutchik's 8 categories, or Ekman's 6. On the best data that I've been able to find, we got a cross-validation F measure of 60%. That's not particularly good. The reason is that we don't have enough data. We don't have enough annotated data. We have no examples of, not enough examples of here's some text and here's the emotion in the text, and here's some more and here's the emotion. Because these machine learning models, they need that sort of information to be able to work. Without that information, it's very difficult for machines to interpret language. It's a big area of research which has really not been moving very far. Well, depends on your perspective. Anybody in that area of research will see lots of innovation and lots of fast movement, but in terms of actually being able to understand human speech, there's quite a long way to go. That we might, well, it's hard to predict, but we might not see anything for the next couple of decades at least, convincing value. So yeah, I mentioned this Chinese data. They made a deep learning model, which is a neural network model based on this Chinese data. And for valence and arousal, they got this was a correlation again. Not sure why they use correlation in this case, but anyway, but the correlations of like nearly 0.8 for valence and 0.6 for arousal, which is more or less in line with the what we get for the categorical case. So you can see that there's something needs to be done to improve this situation, and there's a couple of approaches that I'm going to show you in a sec. Yeah, note there we're going to do some more annotation in English, just because basically there isn't any. As much for providing evaluation data as for providing data for building models. I wanted to make a quick pause. Hopefully it's about halfway through. Not too bad. Has anyone got any questions at this point? Has anyone got any comments?
How did you measure linguistic expression of emotion? Simply words, or 7%?
So, to be honest, I don't know. I can't remember the details of that paper and how they did it.
Then I'm a linguist. I have to give it.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And I would have to go and look it up and tell you after that. Yeah. I can tell you how we're doing it now, or how we're detecting emotion, but in terms of the proportion of emotion expression, some sort of controlled experiment where they I know, restricted it or something like that. I'm not sure. Yeah.
That's Moravian. He's a psychologist, right?
Yeah.
And it will not be very sophisticated in linguistic terms, probably
That's
counting interjections and things like that. I haven't read it. But
I would expect that they gave people different communications and kind of restricted it in some ways, and so that they could and then asked people with through some sort of psychometric quiz about the amount of emotion they detected or something like that. that they're probably using psychological psychometric tools in combination with controlling the conditions in which people are experiencing or perceiving emotions. Okay, so the first, and I think the most promising, at least in the short-term approach for improving the situation for emotion detection in text is what is often called distant learning. The idea here is to use signals from the authors of text that have clear emotional meaning as, if you like, labels, emotion labels on those texts. And you know, the classic label, the classic example is emoji. The most common emoji are these emoji, you know, these pictures with faces, and the faces have particular emotional expressions, and can be very strongly connected with particular emotions. So the idea would then be you collect a large amount of data that contain emoji. You say that this particular emoji means that emotion, another emoji means another emotion, and then you have a large amount of annotated data. With a large amount of annotated data, even if it's noisily annotated, so emoji won't always be used in the way you expect, so long as it's mostly right, that'll be enough to produce a model which is also going to be mostly right. And in fact, so long as it's mostly right, you can even get a model which is more right than the mostly right of the, anyway. So this is, I think, very encouraging. I thought, okay, well, let's collect some tweets with emoji in them. I found the 400 most commonly used emoji and collected all the tweets for a couple of weeks. And lo and behold, I collected 100 million tweets in 2 weeks. That's a, you know, even for data scientists, that's already a large amount of data. And if we can label even 10% of that data down to 10 million tweets, that is ample for producing a really powerful model. The problem with smaller amounts of data is, especially with something as subtle as emotion, is that the variety in the way in which humans express emotion linguistically is very broad. And unless you have examples from every single way in which people express emotion in your training data, in your labeled data, your model is never going to be able to detect the ones that are not in your labeled data. That's why you need a lot of data, especially for something like emotion, which is very subtle, and or can be. Not always. Sometimes it's very obvious, but okay. So yeah, supervised emotion models. This is a machine learning approach where you have data when you have labels on the data, and then you use that to extrapolate to try and predict the labels from other data. And there's lots of mathematics behind it, lots of different approaches, and it works really quite well and has been used in a very wide range of contexts. It's the main thing used for sentiment analysis, and in fact emotion analysis. So the problem then, I've mentioned that the small annotated data set, so the models perform poorly. But another important point is it's very difficult to evaluate them. If you don't have a good gold standard data set, then how do you evaluate? How do you know if your model is doing well? You can evaluate it on the data you train the model with, but that's not really valid. You really need to evaluate outside of the data that you train on. Because there could be particular patterns, particular things about the data that you have, kind of consistent patterns in that data which don't exist in other data. And your model will use those particular patterns to predict the emotion in the training data. But then when you have other data, those patterns won't exist and the model will not perform as well. It's called overfitting. There are many approaches, and one of them is to use evaluation data which is completely separate from the training data. So there's two approaches that we're following to improve this situation. One is just annotate some more data. It's going to suffer from this problem. There's only going to be a couple of thousand examples. It's probably not going to be enough for a supervised model, or of good quality anyway. But the important thing is it'll give us a standard to evaluate against. And that's really a first step in any scientific endeavor, that you need to be able to measure your success or failure. The other one was we're working on distant learning. So more about that later. So we did more about that now, in fact. We did a pilot study early in the year where we investigated distant learning. So we collected a couple of 100,000 tweets. That's very easy to do with the Twitter public API. And we manually selected, we looked at common emoji, and a group of us sat down and said, what does this emoji represent? What does that one represent? We just manually associated emoji with emotions in the hope that we would get it right. This is a pilot study, it's a proof of concept. So, and then we took 360 of these tweets, removed the emoji that we were using as the manual labels, and asked people to try and say what emotion was present. Now here we use the Ekman scheme, the 6 categorical emotions. So the first main conclusion is that, well, we didn't do too badly picking the emotion correspondence with emoji, but we didn't actually do all that well either. And so that indicates that we really need to do a closer analysis of the way people are actually using emoji in order to have a much clearer idea of how we can associate emotions with particular emoji, or in fact particular combinations of emoji. What we will likely do, this is kind of ongoing work, but what we will likely do is make a very simple model which is more than just presence or absence of emoji. It'll be presence of emoji with a particular set of words or something like that. But a very simple model with very high precision. There's that word, again, it's a measure of accuracy. Precision is about the accuracy of the positive examples. So basically, if I have a high precision model and I say, this has that emotion, then there's a very big chance that that's correct. It means if I say this one doesn't have that emotion, I might be completely wrong, I don't care. I want a high precision model because I want to make quality training data. So I need to have a high degree of confidence that the labels that I'm putting on are the correct labels, or at least I want to have the highest that I can achieve. So probably we're going to build a slightly more complex model than just presence or absence of emoji for our distant labeling. One thing here, the annotator agreement, a kappa of 0.51 is often described as moderate agreement. That's more or less in line with other emotion annotation that I've seen in the literature. It's a tricky thing, and people aren't always in agreement about how to interpret expressions of emotion.
What do you call it, distant learning?
I guess distant in the sense that you have your labeled training data, your gold standard, that's close. But what you're doing is you're looking much further afield and trying to infer labels in a lot more data, but without actually looking at them closely, without actually examining each and every one and getting a human to say, yes, it's got that, no, it's got, you know. You use some sort of semi-automated approach with a high precision model. The simplest example is just presence or absence of particular markers. And use that to make, if you like, noisily labeled data. So your labels are not as confident as they might be if a human did it. Although, as you see, humans are not that confident either. But yeah, it's distant. The data that you're labeling is, I think that's the idea.
And who are the people who are judging this joy or disgust? Do you have a sample?
This pilot study was researchers at the Insight Center, which is, it's a very international center. Most of these people have English as a second language. I think that, well, but they're also intelligent people and interested. They're not lazy about it. So there's pros and cons.
So wasn't there random?
Can we wrap up in about 5 minutes?
Okay, I better move a bit quickly. Yeah. I think I'm going to leave part of this off. But, so here, these results, so this is this F1 measure again, kind of a weighted accuracy to take into account imbalanced data. You'll see that the F measures for the examples where we have very few tweets are very low. But for the ones where we have more tweets, it's a bit better. That's really typical of a machine learning problem. When you have very few examples, it's just really hard to make a model. You don't have enough data. But the important thing here is that using distance supervision, so when I used these emoji as labels on the 190,000 tweets, and then built a model using those 190,000 distant labeled tweets, I actually predicted the annotated emotion better than when I used the emoji themselves in the annotated. So each of the annotated tweets contained one of these emoji. When I used that emoji that was in that tweet as the label, as the emotion label, my distant learning model actually did a better job of predicting what the people thought than the labels, the distant labels. What this means is that there were linguistic markers that the model was able to detect that contradicted the presence or absence of particular emoji. And that means that the distance learning is working, that with better defined emoji correspondences and perhaps more data, 190,000 is not too bad, but for deep learning models they say 10 million is a good number. Then there's real hope for getting a better model out of this. Quickly about annotation. So we're doing, in fact we've done the first round of dimensional annotation. We're doing comparisons between tweets. We're saying in which tweet is the author happier, or in which tweet is the author more confident. The reason for this is that many people have said that human judgments of comparisons are much more consistent than absolute judgments. So if we gave them a 5-point scale, then people have said that there'll be less consistency in the position on that 5-point scale that people will attribute than if you say which one is more, if you compare two and say which is more or less. One of the things we might do actually is to annotate on a 5-point scale as well and provide further evidence for this phenomenon. But anyway, so we've annotated 2,000 tweet pairs. Now, the inter-annotator agreement here, there's the Krippendorf alpha, it's a different measure to kappa that I mentioned before, and it's a little bit less optimistic. So I got 0.51, which happens to be the same number, it's complete coincidence, but it's actually a little bit better than the 0.51 in the previous study. I didn't have time to dig up, I calculated the alpha for the previous annotations as well, and it was quite a bit less, I think around 0.45 or 0.4. So we are getting more consistent annotations in this data. So we'll be running a second round. We're going to, using the first annotated data, we're going to choose pairs in order to maximize the quality of a ranking. We want to use this to rank the tweets, and then we can assign a number to each tweet and get, at the moment we only have annotation for pairs of tweets. We want to have a number for a single tweet, but for that we need to do a ranking, and you need a lot of pairs of data to get a good ranking. But if you strategically choose further pair, once you have a base, you strategically choose pairs that will improve the ranking, so ones where you don't yet have enough information to tell if one is bigger than the other, then you can get to a good ranking with much less data. So that's our aim for the next round. And also we're, like I mentioned, we're considering using a 5-point scale to assess the consistency of, to assess whether the relative annotations are more consistent than the absolute ones. It's kind of a control, I suppose. And I've mentioned this is going to be good for making a high precision model. Maybe we'll make supervised models as well, but don't hold your breath, it might not be that good. But importantly for evaluation of other models. How are we doing? We're done. So I was going to talk a little bit about multilingual WordNet, but it's quite tangential, so I think I'll just leave that out. And if you're interested, you can come and talk to me about it later. Any questions?
Well, if nobody else has a question, maybe I can ask how you see the kind of work that you're doing interfacing with how you see the kind of work that you've been doing and your colleagues, how it interfaces with the range of research that you've already encountered at this conference.
So I see a number of ways in which there can be kind of productive, I guess, interaction here. One is the good use cases where it's very interesting to measure emotion, and where there are some resources available for high quality annotation. Any sort of machine learning model really needs some high quality annotation in order to get anywhere. So that's how we can benefit. Well, we as in the people making these analytical models. But I think there's a benefit in the other direction as well, that at the moment, if you're using close reading as your approach for analyzing emotion, the volume of data that you can investigate is quite small. Thousands is already many. But for people in machine learning, thousands is a small number. We talk about millions. And if you want to investigate processes on a larger scale, these are the sorts of models that you can use to do that. So that's where I think that, so from a more social sciences perspective, there can be interesting questions asked, help with providing annotation and setting up the annotation and asking the right questions of the annotator, and then from the more technical side, we can use that to build models which can then provide insights on a much larger scale than is otherwise possible.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Unless there are any other urgent issues, the thing is that the next sessions are starting up now. So we'll end with a round of applause for Ian. Yes, thank you.